Okay, we've talked about insect pests and other pests. Now we have to talk about pesticides. How do we control insects, for example? We saw some methods earlier in special topic number 2 of how other insects, the fire ant, can control insects to some extent. But by and large, that's not sufficient. So what I want to do first of all is talk about natural pesticides. And it turns out most people now believe, or many scientists at least, believe that all plants, vegetables, fruits, nuts, marine organisms produce their own complement of natural pesticides. Not necessarily to kill the pest, but to repel the pest, feeding deterrents. And that's shown on this slide. This is a compound isolated from Curacao. Curacao is the island next to Aruba in the Caribbean near Venezuela. Produces 4 different compounds, novel structures that have never been seen before. Each one is a repellent or a feeding deterrent to a different species of fish. This one is really interesting because you can imagine by elimination, this proton is acidic because it's conjugated to the carbonyl, as we're going to see in a week or so. And you can imagine elimination of chloroform. So that compound is probably one of the compounds that releases chloroform into the environment, a natural product found in the ocean. Here's another species, a moss animal, a bryozoan, that is really nondescript. You would never collect one of these if you go scuba diving, but in fact it produces 4 different compounds, each one of which is deterrent to a different species. And notice again, the bromines are ortho and pair to the oxygen. Nature knows the rules of aromatic electrophilic substitution, as you all do, of course. But not all ocean creatures rely on chemical defense. Now, if you've been snorkeling or diving, you know, in fact, that it's very difficult to touch these fish. They're so quick. They don't need chemicals for defense. They just can't be touched, basically. And the sea anemone is always in the clownfish is always in a sea anemone for protection. But, in fact, not all fish are quick enough, as it turns out. Groupers, in fact, are an exception. If you go to the Cayman Islands, there's a dive site in the Cayman Islands where groupers love to be petted. They will come up to you, as long as you pet them with the scales, of course, not against. Just amazing fish. And some are really huge, up to, I think, 200 pounds. I was diving there about 4 years ago, and after we left this site, somebody bumped me in the leg. It was a grouper. It wanted more petting. It was unbelievable. Lionfish, on the other hand, which were not indigenous to the Caribbean, they're from the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, but they're now the scourge of the Caribbean, in fact. They have no natural predators, although now dive masters are feeding lionfish to groupers. And so they're acquiring an appetite for lionfish, despite these very poisonous barbs, as you can see. And they're everywhere. If you go to this part of the world, snorkeling or diving, you're going to see lionfish. Beautiful fish, but they're killing all of the reef fish. And you can see, it's either a bite or a spine injury. And so now, in fact, if you go to one of these resorts for dinner, most likely you're going to have lionfish for dinner, because that's all they're good for, basically. Frogfish use camouflage. Now, it's difficult to see, but here's an eye here and a mouth in here someplace. And again, here is an eye and a mouth. Use camouflage. And here there are actually 2, maybe 3, but you can see the mouth is open and the eyes. The way they catch their fish, they actually have a lure, have a bait at the end of their mouth. And this will attract other fish, and then they'll eat the fish that approaches. Again, you can see an eye here. The rest of it, I'm not sure. Maybe that's the mouth. I'm not sure. So again, those guys don't need chemicals necessarily. Yeah, question?
I was noticing on that frogfish 2 slides back, it has the parasites on it. Do they have any sort of defense against that?
I'm not sure. They probably do, but I'm not sure. Yeah, good question. Yeah, if you have any questions, just kind of jump out. It's hard to see in the dark. These guys are very poisonous. They look like stones, but it's very easy to step on these guys, and in some cases can be fatal. Here's another related fish. These guys are too big to eat. They don't need chemicals, of course, and they don't necessarily swim fast, but they don't have to worry. And the whale sharks. But it's a giant vacuum, so you have to be careful not to get too close, even though they eat plankton. And these guys, barracuda, of course, don't use chemicals for chemical defense. These guys, even though they don't necessarily swim away, you know, they don't need chemicals for their own defense. And of course, sharks don't either. Pufferfish, they're kind of bluffing. They puff up, as you may know, but the spines are actually soft. They're not sharp. They're kind of soft, but they would in theory, scare away potential predators. But lots of creatures, of course, do use chemicals. We saw earlier nudibranchs, for example. Jellyfish, this guy is really poisonous. I actually picked up a dead one a long time ago on the coast of Hawaii, and my arm went numb for about 20 minutes. It's just amazing what the venom is right at the very end. This was on the beach, apparently dead. Nudibranchs we've talked about before. They can't swim away. They don't have a shell, don't have teeth, but they have chemicals that really will thwart any attack by, for example, fish or even sharks. Yeah, this guy actually has chemicals, but he doesn't make his own chemicals. He gets chemicals from these guys, from tunicates. This guy, very, very poisonous, cone shells, cone snails, and they have a brominated tryptophan amino acid that they use in a protein for chemical defense, and they're actually now being used in the clinic, these compounds. Lots of seaweeds produce active compounds. This is one that is in the cancer clinic now in Japan. And this guy was isolated from the Indian Ocean from a sponge. And just to show you that each individual sponge, much like the gypsy moth, very small number of compounds. The concentration is so small, it took 2,400 kilos of sponge to get only 5 milligrams of compound. So clearly we can't rape the ocean to get enough compound for cancer prevention. So what is being done now, in California, for example, growing these animals, sponges and bryozoa, in the laboratory, and then you can extract the compound without damaging the environment. We're now looking at different parts of the ocean. As you can see, deep water gorgonians, soft coral off the coast of Maui. And fire coral, you never want to touch this. Again, it has a chemical that will cause very painful burns. Now, all of these guys, all of these individual organisms, encrusting sponges, produce their own complement of chemicals, really to prevent this guy from encroaching this guy's territory on the reef. And some of these have very, very good anti-cancer activity. Sponges we've talked about before, the brominated diphenyl ethers, the brominated phenols we've talked about. Okay, here's another example where we've seen the sea hare before. It produces a compound, a novel structure, that repels sharks, actually. And seaweeds as well. Of course, they're anchored to the reef. They don't have sharp teeth or shells. They can't swim away. They rely on chemicals for chemical defense. Here's a famous one, Asparagopsis taxiformis. This is now the favorite edible seaweed of native Hawaiians. You can buy this in Waikiki on the beach. It actually produces 100 different organohalogen compounds. And some of these are very reactive in the SN2 reaction. We're going to talk a little bit more about this. But anytime you have a carbonyl group and a potential leaving group on the alpha carbon, It's very reactive in the SN2 reaction for reasons that I think we may talk about later. We don't know why this seaweed makes all these compounds, presumably for repellents, for chemical defense, to prevent bacteria from killing the seaweed. The major compound turns out to be bromoform. And we'll talk about how this forms, I think, in chapter 22. Here's another case of red seaweed off the coast of California, San Diego. And again, the workers involved in the isolation of these compounds, again, they're all alpha brominated ketones, as you can see, became allergic. They developed rashes because these are like tear gases, as you can see. And what happens, this reaction is called the haloform reaction, which again, we're going to have in chapter 22. Another example, and this has very good anti-cancer activity against leukemia, at least. Here's a compound produced in us. We don't know why we make it, but it has to do with rapid eye movement sleep. And it's a brominated ketoester, ketone and an ester, as you can see. Very interesting compound. It's probably the only brominated compound in humans. Chloroform also is formed out in the forest. When a tree dies, it has to be recycled. Nature does this in part with an enzyme, chloroperoxidase, which we've talked about already. And you can demonstrate this in the laboratory. Jim Hornig, who was a chemistry professor here at Dartmouth for a long time, the library over in Burke is named after him. He found that humic acid, which has a lot of these units, can react with bleach, be chlorinated, because again, OH, good electron donating group, very active benzene ring. It's chlorinated a bunch of times. And once you break the aromaticity of the ring, then of course it can open up and eventually liberate chloroform by, again, the haloform reaction that we'll talk about. And this is the origin of the chloroform, in part, that we're breathing now. Most of the chloroform in the atmosphere is natural, as you can see, produced by all of these organisms, not just in the ocean, but a lot of terrestrial plants. Termites produce chloroform, we think, as an ant repellent. And in fact, if you go to a mound around the world someplace, go in, measure the chloroform concentration, it's 1,000 times higher than the ambient concentration. Also fungi. Some termites. And all of these organohalogen compounds that we've talked a lot about, here's bromopropane, isopropyl iodide, all these compounds are produced by seaweeds. In fact, the smell of the ocean, if you go to Cape Cod or Hampton Beach, it has a distinctive smell, sort of like halogen, like bleach. And I think it's due in part to these compounds. But nature can't make any tertiary halides. T-butyl bromide can't be made for some reason, but all of the other halides, primary, secondary, if you look at these, here's one that has all three halogens on one carbon. Just an amazing compound. Probably chiral. We're not sure yet. My hometown, San Francisco, I was down there, or back there a few years ago, I guess, went down under the Golden Gate Bridge, and you can smell from the seaweeds here, the smell of halogen. Now, methyl bromide is interesting. It's also a natural product. Ironically, it was banned in California as a fumigant because it is toxic. It's a good SN2 substrate, as you guys know, but it's also produced naturally by all these vegetables. And the authors here, and ironically, these guys are in California. They're in Riverside, California, but it's now been banned as a fumigant, even though it's produced naturally to some extent. And they conclude that it's probably significant, the concentration. And rapeseed, this plant also produces it, one of the examples. Now, it was used as a fumigant to kill termites in California, roaches. And what you would do, because methyl bromide's a gas, you would envelop the house in a giant tent and pump in methyl bromide to kill everything inside. Hopefully everyone is out, the people, obviously, and all the bugs are dead. But now it's no longer used. This is a case you may recall a couple of years ago in St. John. these guys were poisoned because they were in a condo. The condo underneath theirs was fumigated with methyl bromide, and the methyl bromide went up into their condo, and they got very, very sick, in fact, and the father may never recover. Okay, fluoroacetic acid is a natural pesticide. It's very interesting because despite the fact that the other halo acids and acetates, if you have a bromine, chlorine, iodine here, that bond is broken readily, and those are toxic for that reason. Fluoroacetate, you never break the carbon-fluorine bond because, again, fluoride is not a good leaving group, and yet this is incredibly toxic. When you take biochemistry, you'll learn that this gets incorporated into the Krebs cycle. It's converted to fluorocitric acid that blocks an enzyme in the Krebs cycle, which is essential. It's in all of you right now. But it's found in plants in various countries, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, and along with these other compounds. Here's the plant. Very, very toxic, as you can see. The lethal dose is less than a gram. All these animals are affected by fluoroacetate, except this toad, for some reason, has an enzyme, built-in enzyme that detoxifies it perhaps. And also this possum in parts of Australia has very high toxicity. Again, the lower the number, the more toxic the compound. LD50 is, again, the lethal dose in milligrams of compound per kilogram of body weight that will kill half of the animal population. That's the 50. This possum is essentially immune to the effects of fluoroacetate for some reason. This slide really illustrates how toxic this is. And again, you'll learn more about this when you take biochemistry. Here's another case, a very, very active compound produced by an Ecuadorian frog. It's up to 1,000 times more potent than morphine. It's almost too toxic, too efficient to be used as an analgesic, but Abbott Laboratories in Chicago are now developing this as a new analgesic. Okay, we've talked about the pests. Now we're going to look at pesticides. There are 4 groups of pesticides we're going to talk about very briefly. A lot of this is covered in Chem 63 in much more detail if you happen to take that in the summer. We'll talk about natural pesticides, organophosphates, very toxic compounds, and the forerunner to the nerve gases that you've been reading about in the Middle East, perhaps, the carbamates, and then the chlorinated compounds. We'll talk mainly about insecticides. Herbicides we'll talk about on Monday a little bit, but depending on the pest, you have all kinds of different names, of course. These are all on Canvas, by the way. So these are some of the pesticides we'll look at. But actually, going way back, sulfur was used a long time ago in Italy and Greece, because it was found that if you burn sulfur, which is natural, of course, it's in the ground, you produce SO2, and that is a very good antiseptic used by winemakers, in fact, to kill germs and to prevent oxidation. Still used today to some extent. Arsenic was used, again, a very long time ago, arsenic trioxide. The trouble with this, it can't be metabolized. Arsenic trioxide is already basically metabolized. It can't change anymore, unlike the organic pesticides we're going to talk about. Again, the Chinese used this a very long time ago. It's poisonous, of course. You read about this all the time. Very persistent. Here's an orchard, I think apple orchard maybe, that was treated 25 years, every year more arsenic, and now this area is totally contaminated. It can never be used for anything. Now nicotine, again, a very early pesticide recognized by the Pilgrims that the tobacco plant had no insect pests. And it's because of nicotine. Nicotine is very poisonous and is a very good insecticide, actually. Still used today. It acts sort of like a nerve agent, inhibits this enzyme we'll talk about in special topic number 5. It's chiral, it's optically active because it's made enzymatically in the tobacco plant, and very toxic. Again, the lower the LD50, the more toxic is the compound. Anything below 100 is considered to be toxic. Organophosphates, we'll come back to some of the natural compounds in just a minute. The first one to be synthesized way back in about 1854 or so is tetraethylpyrophosphate, extremely poisonous compound, although the French chemist who first synthesized it, I mean, I love the French, I love their wine, he was not a very good chemist. And that saved his life because he tasted his preparation. And we know today, had he purified it, he would have died. Very toxic compound. Pyrethrins is probably the most toxic of all organophosphate insecticides, no longer used. It's killed a lot of people over the years. When it's been used on wheat, the wheat is then made into flour and bread, and that compound doesn't decompose very rapidly. People eat the bread and die. But it was banned in 1972. Malathion, in contrast, is much less toxic for reasons that we actually talk about in 63, and that can be used against mosquitoes, for example, and flies and gnats in populated areas. It's a very non-toxic organophosphate compared to parathion. Just an amazing difference. And these are used on your pet collars to kill fleas. So it was synthesized by this guy in 1854. It's an extremely toxic compound, but that was not known until 1932, when Germany could not import nicotine, for example. They had to find and invent their own pesticides, and so they began exploring organophosphates and found that this compound is really toxic. And then some other ones were also synthesized. You don't have to worry too much about this. But you can see how the toxicity level differs from LD50 of 8, very, very toxic, to malathion, which is essentially non-toxic. Malathion is less toxic than table salt or aspirin. And here he is. And all these guys tasted it. It was so impure that it didn't affect any of them. It's just amazing. Okay, the carbamates involve a functional group that I mentioned last week briefly. The carbamate is a hybrid of an ester and an amide. It's a carbonyl. On one side you have an ester, the other side you have an amine. And in fact, the reactivity is comparable, or is really intermediate between those two functional groups. 7 is widely used still, fairly safe. You can see LD50's fairly high, so not very toxic. These guys are a little bit different. Nature makes physostigmine, which is a natural carbamate. You can see here's the carbamate unit, very, very toxic, as you can see. And this is, as you'll see, was used as a drug of divine justice in just a minute. But in India, a long time ago, there was a terrible accident where methyl isocyanate was used to make 7, and I'll show that on the board perhaps later, maybe next week. And that there was somehow introduced into the tank of methyl isocyanate water, and water reacts with this very rapidly, much like an acid chloride in water, and it exploded out of the tank and sprayed the city with this gas. And you can see about 4,000 people died, basically, well, 2,000 people right away. Very, very terrible accident. Even today, it's not really known if it was a chemical accident or deliberate sabotage by a worker who was disgruntled, actually, and simply connected the water pipe into the tank. Here's Bhopal. The Calabar bean is a plant found in West Africa, and if you're accused of committing a crime in one of these countries like Cameroon, you have to eat some of these beans. Normally one bean is fatal, and so usually you die and then you're judged to be guilty. But sometimes you survive. And I think my own theory is that if you survive, you just had a recent meal of fish. Fish are loaded with amine nucleophiles. Nucleophiles, as you guys know, I think, will break this bond right here, attack the carbonyl, and detoxify the compound. And then you survive and you can go home to your family. Ironically now, Physostigma, even though it's very toxic, is used to treat Alzheimer's disease and is an antidote to strychnine poisoning. Here's what these beans look like. Okay, DDT, of course, is in the news a lot. This was kind of the prototypical chlorinated hydrocarbon pesticide. It's actually a mixture of the para-prime isomer, and you make this by aromatic electrophilic substitution. Just imagine taking chlorobenzene and trichloroacetaldehyde, this reactive aldehyde because of the trichloromethyl group, and you get like a Friedel-Crafts acylation, only it's an aldehyde, so it goes twice. And you then get a mixture, mainly para-para, but also some orthopara, as you guys would predict. This compound was used in Hanover to try to control the Dutch elm disease. I showed you those trees from 1942 before the Dutch elm disease took hold. It's less toxic, as you can see, than DDT. And the reason for that, I think, again, methoxy is electron donating. So the benzene rings in methoxychlor are electron rich. And what that means is they're more susceptible to oxidation, to metabolism, unlike the electron withdrawing effects of chlorine, making these rings less susceptible to oxidation. But nonetheless, it really didn't work very well. DDD is related to this. It has one less chlorine. The Germans actually, to prevent typhoid fever in Italy, for example, used instead of DDT, they invented this compound that they used. DDT goes way back. It was actually first synthesized a long time ago, 1874, in Germany. It wasn't recognized to be very effective against killing mosquitoes and ticks and flies, and it's still today the best way to kill mosquitoes, as it turns out, until 1940 or 1939 or so. And this guy, Mueller, this should be, won the Nobel Prize for this. Very toxic to insects, not toxic to mammals. It's never killed a human being. In fact, a friend of mine in California used to eat DDT before his lectures, a famous entomologist, just to show that DDT is not toxic. The trouble is, and this is the case with other chlorinated compounds, it's very water insoluble, very fat soluble, so it tends to go into your fat and stay there, and it biomagnifies in the environment as a result. You'll see that, I think, on the next slide. Very persistent. It's hard to break the carbon-chlorine bond for the reasons I just talked about. This ring is not very reactive to oxidation, to metabolism, so it hangs around for a long time. And you can see that here on Long Island, they had gnats or mosquitoes maybe. They applied very low concentrations of DDT that certainly killed the gnats, but got into the seafood, the one-cell animal plankton. They're eaten by fish, fish eaten by birds, and you can see the magnification is just enormous. And then finally, the birds have biological effects. PCBs we haven't really talked about, but the same thing. You have this biological magnification. Okay, the silver lining to DDT, in addition to the fact that it's the best way to prevent malaria by killing mosquitoes, is the orthopara prime DDD compound is an anti-cancer drug used at Hitchcock to treat cancer of the adrenal gland. A very effective compound called a mitotane, as you can see, and it's this particular isomer. Any questions about any of this so far? Okay, lindane is another compound. Michael Faraday, who discovered benzene in 1825, also discovered the fact you can take benzene and chlorine gas and photolyze it. Now, you don't get aromatic electrophilic substitution. You rather chlorinate all three double bonds in the benzene, and you get a mixture of these 5 compounds, one of which is actually chiral, so that would be racemic. All these other compounds have a plane of symmetry. They're all mesocompounds. And ironically, only one of these is effective at killing bugs. Again, illustrating the fact that receptors in insects and in us are chiral. So only this compound is a good insecticide, as you can see. Fairly non-toxic to mammals, as you can see, but very toxic to bugs. But again, it does persist in the environment because it's hard to break carbon-chlorine bonds. Ironically, nature makes very similar compounds. These three compounds are also produced by seaweeds, and in fact, one of which is even better than lindane at killing mosquito larvae. Okay, the other type of chlorinated compounds are the so-called birdcage compounds. Now, these are compounds formed by a Diels-Alder reaction that I'm not going to show you. We talk more about this in Chem 63. But these compounds, especially the two on the bottom, were the only compounds that had any efficacy against the fire ant, Kepone and Mirex. Dieldrin, you may recall, was used against the cockroaches in this country and in Africa, and the other compounds as well. All of these are more toxic to humans than the DDT types. So most of these have now been banned. They were used for a long time to kill termites, and also, again, the fire ant in particular. Okay, the natural pesticides are really interesting because, again, these are compounds produced naturally by chrysanthemums in the case of the pyrethrins over here, rotenone, nicotine, of course, we've talked about, but all of these other compounds produced by plants seem to be anti-insecticidal in their activity. Even cocaine. As you can see here, very, very effective insecticide, very low concentrations. And again, the cocoa plant, like the tobacco plant, really has no natural enemies apart from man, of course. Cocaine is actually a diester, and it's related to atropine. Atropine is a compound, also an ester, and atropine is the nerve gas antidote we'll talk about a bit later on. These are alkaloids produced by plants. Okay, rotenone is interesting. This is the structure of rotenone. And right away, you can see the benzene rings automatically are more electron-rich than the DDT types. So they degrade in the environment. They don't hang around like the DDT does. They're found in these roots, as you can see. Still used today in nurseries. Fairly toxic to fish, but really non-toxic to mammals. Fairly low toxicity. And again, degraded by heat and light. Used in this country to try to control the walking catfish. Walking catfish is this amazing fish introduced by accident from Africa. A few escaped, as you'll see, in 1967. So here are some USDA workers throwing rotenone, that's the white solid, into this pond to try to kill the walking catfish. But as the name implies, the walking catfish can walk out of this pond and find another pond, as it's doing here. It can live out of water for, I want to say a month. I don't think it's quite that long. It still has to find water, as you can see. Oh, 85 days, here you go, longer than a month. And they multiplied from 12 to now 10 million of 1982. So, marching on Atlanta, yeah. But this time, the USDA was a little bit ahead of the walking catfish. Get the idea. Lots of these fish around, as you can see, that are really major pests around the world, in fact. What's that?
How do you know it's
I'm not sure. You'd have to ask these guys. I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay, pyrethrins are probably the ideal insecticide, the pyrethrins. They're very low toxicity to mammals, very high toxicity to insects, readily biodegradable, easy to come by, easy to synthesize, as it turns out. Although they were first isolated from chrysanthemums, as you can see. Very potent. This is the ideal insecticide if you have a yellow jacket nest, a wasp nest in your house, your parents' house. You want to use a pyrethrin spray because it works right away. It is metabolized here. This, what kind of a carbon is that, do you think? Why do you get metabolism there? And again, metabolism is always oxidation. So why does that methyl oxidize more than, say, this one? It's allylic. Yeah, that's right, alpha carbon. It's allylic. It's like benzylic because of the double bond. And so even though this is very good, it is, in fact, oxidized at that position. So oftentimes when you buy some of these sprays, they're also treated with an antioxidant, like ascorbic acid, like vitamin C. But you can see it's metabolized fairly rapidly. And in fact, now synthetic compounds, which is really what you'll buy, have this position blocked. So now you can't get metabolism here. And you can see how effective this is per fly. I mean, you're talking about sub-micrograms per fly. You can't even see that much compound. Very, very effective. They come in these sprays. And you can see the size of this white-faced hornet nest. Okay, I want to talk about toxicity a little bit. Everything is toxic, depends on the dose. There are cases of people drinking too much water. In fact, fraternity hazing incidents, there are about 3 that I know of over the past 20 years. You drink too much water, you can't urinate it all at once, your brain gets waterlogged, gets dissolved, and you can die. But water is practically non-toxic, and here's kind of a lethal dose. Slightly toxic, things like soap, alcohol, picloram, and herbicide. Again, very, very high LD50s, so low toxicity for these things. Moderately toxic, table salt, ether, right, some solvent, 2,4-D we'll talk about on Monday. Toxic compounds, aspirin, phenol, of course, was used to execute prisoners in Nazi Germany. Caffeine is in this category. Very toxic compounds, morphine, mercury salts, of course, parathion. Extremely toxic, cyanide, heroin, atropine, and again, fluoroacetate. Super toxic compounds are, with maybe one exception, nerve gas, are natural products. Snake venom, spider venom, marine toxins. And the most toxic molecule I mentioned before is botulinus toxin, Botox. It's a large protein, but it's the single most toxic molecule known. Sorry? No, nerve gas is. Yeah, well, it depends on the dose, of course. We'll talk about this in special topic number 5. Depends on the nerve gas, too. There are 5 or 6 that have different levels of toxicity. Okay, DDT was extremely useful, as I've mentioned a couple times today already, killing mosquitoes, preventing malaria. Before DDT, in Taiwan, they had 1 million cases of malaria, and probably 30% are fatal, something like that. During DDT, the number went way, way down, just unbelievable. And that was true in South America. All these countries had major malaria problems, not so much in this country, but all these other countries. And DDT use essentially wiped out malaria by killing mosquitoes. And here's one country, and you can see, again, before DDT, 3 million malaria cases. DDT was introduced, went down to 100. But then in 1964, because of concerns about DDT, it gets into the environment, gets in all of us to some extent, at least your parents and grandparents maybe, and animals, that maybe we shouldn't use it, even though there was no evidence that it really was toxic to humans at all, despite the effects of birds. So they stopped using it, and you can see malaria cases came back. And that's kind of where it stands today. Although today, now that they're using nets that are impregnated with DDT, so you don't have to spray it around onto food and things. The Zika virus, of course, is another mosquito-borne virus like malaria, although malaria is a parasite, not a virus. And you've been reading about this, a microcephaly, this hideous birth defect. Here's the Zika virus. And again, viruses are really tiny things compared to this cell, this bacterial E. coli cell. And the way it works, as you may know, that the virus has a piece of RNA or DNA, and it's like a syringe. It injects the DNA right into the cell, and then the DNA takes over and replicates itself thanks to the E. coli cell. Okay, this slide's actually the last slide, so I think we'll just stop after this. But this is important. It kind of summarizes the pesticides that we've talked about. Organophosphates have low chronic toxicity. What that means, they don't cause cancer. They don't cause kidney disease. You know, chronic toxicity is over a long period of time. Acute toxicity is very high with parathion, not so much with one of the other ones I mentioned, malathion. Environmental threat, because it's easy to break the phosphorus-oxygen bond in the environment, they degrade right away. There's no threat to the environment. Carbamates also act, and I didn't say this, act with acetylcholinesterase, as organophosphates do, which we'll talk about when we talk about chemical warfare, have low toxicity in terms of chronic toxicity. No evidence they cause cancer, kidney disease, and have high toxicity depending on which carbamate we're talking about. They degrade in the environment. The carbamate unit is hydrolyzed in the environment, as we saw with physostigmine, with nucleophiles like amines. Okay, the chlorinated hydrocarbons, it depends on what they are. Some of these probably do have chronic toxicity. Dieldrin and aldrin, some evidence that they're carcinogenic, not DDT. And the human toxicity, again, depends. Very low for DDT, very high for things like dieldrin, aldrin, the birdcage compounds. And the environmental threat is high because they don't biodegrade very rapidly at all. Natural products made by nature, of course, so they don't persist in the environment, otherwise they would keep building up forever. Low environmental threat, low chronic toxicity, no evidence that any of these compounds cause cancer, but of course they can be very toxic. Nicotine is a very toxic compound, comparable in some cases to nerve gas, very high toxicity. Okay, do you have any questions about this? Yeah?
Could you say again just what human acute toxicity means? What human acute toxicity means?
Kills you right away. You inhale it, you die. That's acute, right away. Chronic over a long period of time. Yeah. Okay, anything else? Yeah?
For DDT, is that what was causing, like in New Jersey and like similar areas, thinning of like bird shells? And like you mentioned the osprey, like I know I'm from the area, so I know it like wiped out osprey populations.
It did, and eagles to some extent as well. What happens, DDT binds with a calcium enzyme, and so the birds can't sequester calcium to build the eggshell. Eggshell is very thin, it breaks when it's laid, and then they can't reproduce. That's the effect of the birds, that's right. And DDT was overused in the 40s and 50s. It was used on food crops as well, and that's kind of a big mistake. It's really only effective against insects like mosquitoes, not to kill beetles that might be on corn. There are other things that are better now for that.